When you think of gladiators, do you imagine brutal warriors fighting to the death? What if I told you that this story is not quite like that? Not everyone was a slave, not all battles ended in blood, and arenas weren't just fun, they were a tool of control. If you want to find out the truth, understand what really happened, and know the myths and facts about real-life gladiators, watch it to the end. What you'll discover here could change everything you thought you knew about them. When talking about gladiators, the most common scene that comes to mind is that of men in chains, forcibly dragged into giant arenas, forced to fight to the death while a bloodthirsty crowd cheers. But this image, which has been reinforced by movies and series, is not the whole truth. Yes, many gladiators were enslaved, but the story is much more surprising than it sounds. Not all gladiators were prisoners without a choice. Believe it or not, some free men chose this life voluntarily. But why? The answer may be shocking: glory, fame, and money. Being a gladiator, for some, was an opportunity to get out of anonymity and become a true star of ancient Rome. Those who stood out won the admiration of the people, had their names engraved on walls, and were sponsored by powerful people, including senators and even the emperor himself. The best were extremely well paid and could live in a luxury that most ordinary people would never dream of having. But none of this happened without preparation. Those who entered the arena first underwent rigorous training in specialized schools, called ludi. There they were trained by experienced instructors, many of them former gladiators, who knew all the combat tactics and ensured that their students had a real chance of survival. Contrary to what many imagine, these trainings were not just torture sessions. Gladiators were valuable investments, so their preparation was taken seriously. They learned to use different weapons, develop quick reflexes, and read their opponent's movements. The longer a gladiator survived, the more he was worth to his sponsors. Have you ever felt that the stories you know about Rome are always the same, without the real details, emotions, and strategies that defined the greatest empire in history? With that in mind, I created the 10 battles that shaped the empire. This book gets straight to the point. Clear, moving, and never-before-seen explanations of how legendary leaders turned battles into historic milestones. You no longer need to get lost in confusing reports. Click on the pinned comment and download now the 10 battles that shaped the Roman Empire. But beware, it is for a limited time. Transform the way you see history and discover what has always been missing in the narratives you thought you knew. Now I'll tell you another very common myth, that all fights ended in death. In fact, many combats were held strategically to entertain the audience without having to kill the fighters. Yes, the arenas were brutal, and a slip could be fatal, but the execution of a gladiator didn't happen all the time. If he fought well and excited the crowd, he could be spared. Many battles were set up to ensure an exciting spectacle, with rehearsed blows and balanced combats. It was a dangerous game, but with a good chance of survival for those who knew how to entertain. The feeding of these warriors was also something taken seriously. Contrary to popular belief, they were not malnourished. Gladiators followed a diet, calculated to ensure strength and endurance. They ate a lot of barley, beans, and dried fruits, and they took a kind of rudimentary supplement made from bone ash, which helped strengthen their bones and muscles. They were, in practice, professional athletes, with specific training and eating routines. The life of a gladiator, of course, was not easy. Even the most famous and well-paid lived under constant risk. Each entrance to the arena could be the last. But for many, what was at stake was worth the danger. Some were fighting to gain freedom, others for glory and wealth, and there were those who simply enjoyed the challenge and adrenaline rush of combat. The games lasted for centuries, evolving according to the rulers and the demands of the public. At the height of the Roman Empire, a famous gladiator could have a status comparable to that of a professional athlete today. Some earned fortunes and were courted by the elite, with the right to parties, banquets, and recognition. But the truth is that, as glamorous as it seemed, few had a happy ending. Most ended up injured, exhausted, or killed at some point. The spectacle always needed new fighters, and the audience always demanded more excitement. Those who could not keep up with this pace were discarded. Over time, the fights lost popularity and were eventually banned. What remained were the myths and stories about these warriors who, slaves or not, marked one of the most brutal epochs in human history. Before proceeding, I saw here that you forgot to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss all the content about Rome that we will always be bringing. If you think that every gladiatorial combat ended with a bloody body in the sand, it's time to forget everything you've seen in the movies. Yes, the fights were brutal, but death was not the inevitable fate of every warrior. In fact, the trainers did everything to prevent their fighters from dying too soon. Think about it. Training a gladiator wasn't cheap. The schools invested a lot of money in food, training, and armaments. Each fighter was seen as a valuable asset, and it didn't make sense to waste it on a single fight. The more fights a gladiator participated, the more money he generated for his sponsors. This means that the arena was not just an extermination camp, but rather a well-planned spectacle. Another thing that no one told you: there were rules. Unlike the idea of uncontrolled carnage, the fights followed specific rules. There were referees who ensured that the fight was fair and that both combatants had a real chance of entertaining the public. Sure, the violence was real, but it didn't always end in death. If a gladiator fought well, showed technique and courage, he could be spared even after defeat. Now let's debunk one of the biggest myths about the arena, the famous thumb gesture. You've seen this scene dozens of times in the cinema. The emperor decides the fighter's fate with a simple thumb up or thumb down. But was it really like that? Historical records show that there is no concrete evidence of this. The real gesture, according to experts, was another: open or close your hand. When the hand was open, the gladiator was spared. When he clenched into a fist, it meant that he had to die. This is the truth that few people know. This is not to say that the fights were safe. Far from it. Serious injuries were common, and a badly injured gladiator could be incapacitated forever. In addition, there were extremely dangerous battles, such as the venations, where gladiators faced wild animals. These combats, yes, were almost always fatal. Fighting lions, tigers, or bears was practically a death sentence, used to entertain the public in an even more cruel way. But here comes the most impressive detail. Many gladiators survived several fights. Some struggled for years and accumulated so much fame that they achieved something unthinkable: freedom. The greatest desire of any gladiator was to receive the rudis, a wooden sword that symbolized his official retirement from the arena. With it, a gladiator could return home as a free man. And what happened next? Some became trainers, helping to prepare new fighters. Others, even after gaining their freedom, chose to continue fighting. Yes, there were gladiators who liked the arena and stayed in it for money and glory. The more popular they were, the higher the value of the prizes they received. Gladiatorial combats were brutal, but they were not simply public executions. The arena was a great spectacle, where skill, entertainment, and money spoke louder than the thirst for blood. The audience didn't just want to see bodies on the ground, they wanted to see skilled warriors who could come back to fight once again. Now think with me, would you have the courage to enter such an arena in exchange for glory and money, or would you rather stay away from it? Tell me here in the comments. If you think that gladiators were just strong guys thrown into the arena without preparation, you are very wrong. These warriors underwent intense training, as rigorous as that of Roman soldiers. It wasn't enough to have strength. They needed to master combat techniques, learn strategies, and develop endurance. The arena wasn't just a battlefield, it was a spectacle, and each fight needed to be exciting enough to keep the crowd hooked to the spectacle. It all began in the ludus gladiatorius, the academies where gladiators were molded. There, they learned how to fight efficiently, predict enemy movements, and adapt quickly. Every strike, every parry, and every dodge was trained until it became automatic. It wasn't just about fighting to survive, it was about fighting to impress. Well-trained gladiators were more likely to be spared and return to the arena for more combat, but there was no single gladiator style. Each fighter was trained according to his category and weaponry. The secutores, for example, used a short sword and a large shield, focusing on the melee attack. The retiarius, on the other hand, were more agile, fighting with trident and net, trying to capture the opponent before the final attack. There were also the threses, inspired by Thracian warriors who used curved swords and small shields. Each style required specific skills and different preparation. The training was brutal. Gladiators ran long distances to build endurance, lifted weights to gain strength, and trained in combat every day. There was no rest. If the body failed in the middle of a fight, fate could be fatal. But brute force wasn't enough. Strategy was essential. The trainers, known as doctores, were usually former gladiators who knew every detail of the arena. They taught the best way to attack, when to retreat, and how to trick the opponent to gain an advantage. And it wasn't just the physique that needed to be trained. Gladiators were also mentally prepared. Fighting in front of thousands of screaming people required extreme self-control. The fear of death, the pressure of the public, and the need to remain calm under tension were all part of the training. They needed to learn to ignore pain, maintain concentration, and react quickly to any threat. The arena did not accept amateurs. Gladiators who didn't stand out didn't last long. Those who became skilled became stars with fans and sponsors, while the weak were eliminated. The training didn't just create warriors, it created true masters of combat, prepared to face any challenge and survive within the greatest spectacle of the Roman Empire. Today, we have stars from football, cinema, and music. In the Roman Empire, the big stars were the gladiators. They weren't just warriors, they were idols. Audiences packed the amphitheaters to watch them fight, cheering and betting money on their favorites. If a gladiator was good enough, his name spread throughout the city like that of a true champion. And this fame was not small. Popular gladiators had loyal fans who drew their faces on walls, wrote their names on walls, and even made offerings for good luck before combat. They were honored as heroes and could receive lavish prizes, from gold and expensive clothes to land and slaves. But it was not only the people who worshipped them. The Roman elite was also fascinated by these warriors. The most famous gladiators were sponsored by nobles and even the emperor. For politicians, having a gladiator under their patronage was synonymous with prestige. The more victories the fighter accumulated, the greater the influence of those who supported him. Now comes a surprising part. The women of Roman high society were obsessed with gladiators. These warriors were symbols of strength and virility, and many wealthy women paid fortunes to spend nights with the most famous. Some fell in love and even left their husbands to live with them, which caused scandals in the elite. There were even cases in which senators tried to prevent their wives from attending the combats, for fear that they would be enchanted by some gladiator. Of course, not everyone reached that level of fame. Most were just another wrestler in the arena, with no privileges or recognition. But those who stood out had a very different life. They were invited to lavish parties, attended banquets, and in some cases had so much power that they were able to influence political decisions. But this fame came at a high price. Gladiators were worshipped, but they also lived in constant danger. The public loved their heroes, but they wanted blood. If a famous wrestler lost, his popularity could end in seconds. What if he died in combat? All it took was a new talent to take his place. In the end, being a gladiator meant living between glory and risk. They were celebrities, desired and respected, but always a sword blow away from death. And don't forget to pick up your digital book, 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. It's important that you get it right now before the units run out. If you think the gladiatorial combats were brutal, wait until you meet the venationes. In these fights, there was no strategy, rivalry, or duel of skills. It was an unfair battle, where men were pitted against wild beasts just to satisfy the crowd's desire for blood. Lions, tigers, bears, and even elephants were let loose in the arena, and on the other side were gladiators, or condemned prisoners, with little or no chance of making it out alive. But the cruelty went beyond what one imagines. To make the spectacle more exciting, and not lose control of the situation, the Romans manipulated the fighting. The animals were often poorly fed, drugged, or even mutilated before the fight. Some had their teeth pulled out, claws cut off, or were kept locked up for days to arrive exhausted at the arena. Thus, they still posed danger, but without the same ability to react. The goal was not a fair battle, but a show that would entertain the audience for as long as possible. Now imagine the scene. A roaring lion, confused, surrounded by a noisy crowd. He doesn't understand where he is. He just knows that he needs to fight to survive. On the other side, a man holding a spear, in a cold sweat, trying not to show fear. The smell of blood permeates the air. The beast advances, and the audience erupts in screams. The fight is not only against the animal, but against panic, fatigue, and the certainty that any mistake can be fatal. In gladiatorial combats, at least there were rules. In the venation, none of this mattered. Many of those who faced these animals were nothing more than condemned prisoners, sent to an execution disguised as entertainment. No training, no proper armor, no real chance of winning. For them, the fight lasted a few minutes. It was only a matter of time before the crowd saw exactly what they had come to watch: blood and death. But not everyone was sent to die. Some gladiators were trained especially for these combats. Called venatores, they learned to face beasts using spears, tridents, and nets. They needed to know the animal's behavior, predict their movements, and attack them at the right time. Even so, survival was never guaranteed. A single slip, and the hunter became the prey. And the public? I watched everything with a mixture of horror and fascination. They bet on gladiators, cheered for exciting fights, and got excited when the battle stretched on longer. For them, it didn't matter who won as long as there was a show. The more brutal, the better. The Venations revealed the cruelest side of the Roman games. Men and animals were thrown into the arena without mercy, reduced to mere instruments of entertainment. Gladiators fought for glory, convicts fought for a less humiliating death, and the animals, forced into a combat they never chose, had no other way out than violence. For the crowd, it was just fun. For those inside, it was a nightmare with no return. When talking about gladiators, the image that always comes to mind is that of the Colosseum in Rome, gigantic, crowded, with warriors fighting until the last blow. But I'll tell you a secret. The Colosseum wasn't the only stage for these fights. In fact, he wasn't even the first. Duels between gladiators took place in arenas scattered throughout the Roman Empire, from small towns to the largest urban centers of the time. Even before the Colosseum existed, gladiatorial fights were already a tradition. They emerged with the Etruscans, a people who inhabited Italy before Rome dominated everything. In the beginning, these combats were funeral rituals, performed to honor the dead. But the Romans saw this as an opportunity to turn simple ceremonies into a spectacle of entertainment. Now, a detail that few people know: the Colosseum was only inaugurated in the year 80 AD, but the combats between gladiators already existed centuries before. Cities such as Pompeii, Carthage, Arles, and Verona had their own arenas, and some of them were older than Rome's most famous building. The amphitheater of Pompeii, for example, was erected around 70 BC, hosting fierce fighting long before the Colosseum was even imagined. In Carthage, in North Africa, there was another imposing arena where the people gathered to watch the deadly duels. And it wasn't just in big cities. Even in smaller provinces, amphitheaters were built to ensure that the excitement of combat reached every corner of the empire. In some regions, theaters were adapted to host the fighting, and in others, smaller arenas provided a more intimate but equally brutal spectacle. And why then did the Colosseum become so famous? Simple. He was the biggest and most impressive of all. With a capacity of about 50,000 spectators, it has become the ultimate symbol of Roman entertainment. In addition, emperors used the spectacles in the Colosseum as a political tool. They distributed bread and promoted free fights to keep the population distracted and satisfied, ensuring popular support. But the truth is that gladiators did not belong only to Rome. They fought in all parts of the empire. In smaller cities or large metropolises, people gathered to watch the clashes. It didn't matter if the arena was a gigantic monument or a simple amphitheater. What mattered was the spectacle, the emotion, and the glory of the combat. The Colosseum may have been the largest, but gladiatorial fights were a phenomenon that took hold of the Roman Empire. These warriors were not stars on a single stage. They were the great attraction of an entire empire, wherever there was an arena ready to receive them. Gladiatorial combats were not just an entertainment spectacle, they were a powerful political tool. The emperors knew that as long as the crowds were fascinated by bloody battles, no one would care about the real problems of the empire. Whenever Rome faced crises such as famine, corruption, or uprisings, the solution was simple: more games, more blood, more distraction. Rome dominated the concept of bread and circuses. The rulers offered free fights, distributed food, and made sure the population had something to get excited about. While the spectators cheered with the duels in the arena, the difficulties of the empire were ignored. It didn't matter if taxes were high, if the war consumed resources, or if inequality grew. The important thing was to keep the people entertained. But the games were not just for distraction, they were also a tool for self-promotion by the emperors. Whoever sponsored the greatest spectacles won the loyalty of the people. An emperor who organized grandiose combats was seen as generous and powerful. The more impressive the event, the more he consolidated himself as a strong ruler. And no one took this strategy as far as Emperor Trajan. To commemorate his military victories, he organized an unprecedented event: 5,000 pairs of gladiators fighting non-stop. That means 10,000 warriors dueling to the death, while a crazed crowd watched. But this was not just a spectacle, it was a show of force. Trajan wanted to make it clear that Rome was invincible, and that he was in absolute command. Games weren't just a symbol of power, they were a tool of social control. The government knew that as long as the people were entertained, it would not organize to question or protest. During the fights, bread and wine were distributed free of charge, reinforcing the idea that the emperor took care of the well-being of the population. This created a sense of stability, even when the empire fell on hard times. Moreover, gladiators were more than warriors. They were symbols of the empire itself. Their struggles represented the discipline, brutality, and glory of Rome. Some emperors chose favorite gladiators to highlight their qualities and reinforce their image before the people. These fighters weren't just fighters, they were pieces of a larger political game. But there was a price to this manipulation. Gladiators were disposable. Many were slaves or prisoners, forced to fight to the death to amuse the crowd. Others entered the arena for money and fame, but they knew that their lives depended on the will of the public and the emperor. It didn't matter how skilled a gladiator was, if he failed to entertain, he was replaced. And here's the great irony. As the crowd watched, cheered and cheered, thinking they were witnessing an epic moment, they themselves were being manipulated. The real game didn't take place in the arena. It took place behind the scenes, where emperors used the blood of gladiators to keep the people distracted and their power unshaken. For centuries, gladiators were the biggest stars in Rome. Their fights filled arenas, made crowds cheer, and were an essential part of the empire's culture. But then the fighting simply disappeared. What happened? Who ended this spectacle that defined an era? The answer lies in the growth of something that would change Rome forever: Christianity. At first, Christians were persecuted and even thrown into the arena as punishment, but over time, their influence grew. The idea that human life had value began to spread. Gradually, the brutality of the fights began to be seen with different eyes. What was once a great spectacle began to generate questions. The first blow against the fighting came from the Emperor Constantine. In the 4th century, he became the first Christian emperor of Rome and decided to cut off imperial funding for the most violent games. He did not immediately ban combat, but he reduced the incentive, taking away from them the prestige they had always had. Without direct support from the government, the arenas began to empty, and the games lost strength. But the definitive end came a few decades later, in 404 AD, at the hands of Emperor Honorius. He officially decreed that gladiatorial combats were forbidden throughout the empire. And there is a fascinating story about what would have been the trigger for this decision. According to legend, a monk named Telemachus was horrified by the violence of the arenas. Determined to end it, he would have entered the middle of a fight and shouted for the gladiators to stop fighting. The crowd, furious at the interruption, attacked the monk with stones until they killed him right there, in front of everyone. Upon learning of what had happened, Emperor Honorius decreed the definitive end of the fighting. To him, it was a clear sign that times had changed and that spectacles of blood no longer had a place in Rome. But it was not just an isolated decision. Roman society no longer saw fighting in the same way. For centuries, watching gladiators kill each other was normal, but now Christianity was growing and transforming the mentality of the people. What was once seen as entertainment is now considered cruel. The arenas began to be abandoned. The wrestlers who were once celebrities were now just a symbol of a bloody past that many wanted to forget. In a few years, what was once a grandiose spectacle became a distant memory. Gladiatorial trainers have lost their role. The last remaining warriors had to adapt or simply disappeared. The irony is that even with the ban, gladiators were never forgotten. His image has survived time. Today, they continue to fascinate the world, whether in movies, books, or popular culture. But the impact of gladiators goes beyond the arenas. They represent resistance, the struggle for survival, and the desire for glory. Even in modern times, the idea of the combatant who faces impossible challenges lives on. Sports, competitions, and even life's daily challenges carry some of that spirit. And if you stop to think about it, the concept of a gladiator has never really disappeared. Competition, sacrifice, and the pursuit of glory are still part of humanity. Modern arenas may not be made of sand and blood, but the desire to overcome challenges and gain recognition remains as strong as it was in ancient Rome. Gladiators may have physically disappeared, but their influence is still present. They have been turned into legends, inspiring generations and shaping narratives of heroism that span centuries. The idea of a warrior who rises even in the face of the impossible remains firmly in the collective imagination. Rome may have tried to erase the gladiators, but their legend is eternal. Their stories are still alive, and the idea of the warrior who fights against everything and everyone still echoes in world culture. The games are over, but gladiators have never ceased to exist in the memory of humanity. Gladiators have always been portrayed as brutal warriors, thrown into arenas to fight to the death, with no choice and no mercy. But now you know that the reality was quite different. Yes, there were slaves forced to fight, but there were also free men who chose this life for glory, fame, and wealth. For many, being a gladiator was a life-changing opportunity, and the best could achieve a status that went beyond the arena. Another great illusion is the idea that all combat ended in death. In fact, gladiators were an expensive investment, and no one wanted to lose a good fighter unnecessarily. If a warrior fought well, even losing, he could be spared to entertain the audience again. In addition, there were rules in combat, and trainers went to great lengths to ensure that their gladiators survived longer. But gladiators weren't just fighters. They were pieces of a larger political game. Emperors used fighting as a distraction for the people, ensuring that no one cared about the real problems of the empire. The concept of bread and circuses was not just an entertainment strategy, but an efficient method of control. While the crowd screamed in the stands, Roma continued to collapse inside. However, as society changed, the brutality of the arenas began to be questioned. With the growth of Christianity, the values of compassion and respect for life gained strength. What was once a spectacle came to be seen as cruel and unnecessary. That was how, little by little, the fighting began to disappear. The final blow came with Emperor Honorius in 404 AD, when fighting was banned for good. And according to legend, the trigger for this decision was the death of Telemachus, a monk who tried to break up a fight and ended up being stoned by the angry crowd. From that moment on, the arenas began to be abandoned, and the last gladiators disappeared forever. And remember, whenever you want to know how Rome became the largest empire in antiquity, just go to the pinned comment and get your digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. Get it right now because the units are limited. If you like this video and want to learn more shocking truths about the story, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps a lot for more people to find out what really happened in the past. See you in the next video.